This is the story of a decision so serious, it shook an entire country. Imagine being a president who suddenly realizes that the people you trusted most, your own hand-picked ministers, are secretly running one of the largest drug networks in West Africa. These weren't enemies from outside. These were his own allies, men who stood beside him in meetings, smiled at press conferences, and promised to serve their country with integrity. So what do you do when the corruption is coming from inside the house? How do you confront a truth so big it could break your government? And once you decide to act, is it really about justice or something else entirely? That night, just before midnight, President Ibrahim Traoré stood alone in his private office. Spread across his desk were photos, dozens of them. Each one told a piece of a horrifying story, not about foreign threats or rebel fighters, but about his own cabinet. These were the faces of men he had personally appointed, men who had sworn loyalty to the nation. But now, he saw the truth, and it made him sick. Luxury cars, secret meetings in dark warehouses, handshakes with drug lords from Colombia, bank transfers routed through shady offshore accounts, even phone call transcripts, disguised as conversations about medical supplies, actually discussing shipments of cocaine worth millions, more than the entire national health budget. He had known for 43 days, and for 43 nights, he hadn't slept properly. Instead, he planned, quietly, carefully, because when you find out your foundation is rotten, you have two options: ignore the cracks or tear it down and rebuild. His decision had already been made, but the moment that pushed everything into motion came in the most unexpected way. A deathbed confession. Colonel Sawadogo, a highly respected border officer, had been shot during what should have been a routine patrol at the Mali border. Bleeding, out in a hospital bed, he whispered a sentence that would change everything. The ministers, they're all in on it. At first, Traoré thought it was just the pain talking, but then Sawadogo gripped his wrist and handed him a small memory card. Everything's on there, he said. Every name, every transaction, every lie. 3 hours later, Sawadogo was dead. The official report blamed his wounds, unofficially. Traoré didn't buy it. The timing was too perfect, too convenient. Someone had silenced him, but it was too late. The memory card had already revealed everything. 18 months of records, audio files, video clips, financial statements. It was worse than anything Traoré had imagined. The Minister of Health was hiding cocaine inside medical aid convoys. The Minister of Transport was issuing fake permits for cartel shipments. The Minister of Commerce had built a web of fake import-export companies to clean the money. This wasn't a side hustle. This was an empire, and it was being run from inside the government. Burkina Faso had become a key route in the global drug trade. Later, the D would label it a narco state in progress. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was the human cost. Reports of villagers who went missing, farmers murdered for refusing to cooperate, border agents who were accidentally killed, and all of it buried under official documents and fake smiles in cabinet meetings. That night, Traoré understood clearly. The next morning would be the most important moment of his leadership. He had quietly built a team of people he trusted. Military officers, intelligence analysts, and investigators who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. People who actually believed in the country. But this mission wasn't safe. These ministers weren't small-time criminals. They had power, connections, and they had already proven they were willing to kill to protect themselves. The plan was tight and dangerous. At 8 a.m., Traoré would call an emergency cabinet meeting, claiming there was a national security threat. And there was, just not the one they were expecting. While the ministers gathered in the presidential palace thinking they were safe, his team would begin raids across the country, all at once, all without warning. Evidence would be seized, assets would be frozen, and before anyone even realized what was happening, every single one of those ministers would be in handcuffs. Traoré had studied the mistakes of other African leaders, men who had tried to clean up corruption, only to be outmaneuvered, betrayed, or even removed from power. He wasn't going to repeat their mistakes. There would be no hints, no second chances, and absolutely no negotiations. This time, justice would come without warning, But what Traoré didn't know, not yet, was that justice always comes at a cost. And sometimes, that cost is your own soul. As the first light of dawn crept in through the palace windows, Traoré stepped out of his study for the first time in hours. Every detail of the operation was etched into his mind. He had gone over the plan countless times. He was ready, but the silence in the corridors hit differently now, thick, heavy, almost like the building itself understood what was about to happen. What began as a mission to purge a corrupt cabinet had grown into something far bigger, a fight for the soul of Burkina Faso, and by the end of the day, nothing, not the government, not the public's trust, not even Traoré himself, would be the same. He was about to make history. No president before him had ever dared to do what he was about to do: arrest his own ministers on charges of high treason and drug trafficking. And by doing so, he was about to send a clear message. In this new Burkina Faso, no one is untouchable. Not even the men who helped build the government from the ground up. But first, he had to make it through the next 12 hours alive. At exactly 1:17 a.m., while Traoré was still in his study reviewing evidence, the first phase of the plan was already underway. A convoy of unmarked vehicles moved quietly through the dark streets of Bobo Dioulasso, the second largest city in the country. No sirens, no flashing lights, just silence, the kind that only comes before something big. Each vehicle moved like a shadow, guided by intelligence that had taken weeks to gather, verify, and cross-check. Leading the operation was Colonel Damiba, a man with a history. 2 years earlier, Traoré had publicly demoted him for what was called conduct unbecoming of an officer. The truth was more complicated. Damiba had openly questioned a military strategy during a cabinet meeting, not disrespectfully, but boldly, in a room where that kind of honesty was dangerous. Back then, Traoré saw it as arrogance, but time had taught him a hard lesson. Pride and loyalty are not the same thing. And while Damiba could be difficult, he wasn't corrupt in a system drowning in compromises. His blunt integrity had become a rare and precious weapon. Even better, his fall from grace had made him invisible. No one would suspect that the disgraced colonel was now leading the president's most sensitive and dangerous operation. Their target was a government warehouse complex on the outskirts of Bobo Dioulasso. According to intel, it was a key hub for cocaine entering West Africa from South America, but officially, it was just a Ministry of Health storage facility. On paper, it housed supplies for rural clinics, medicine, vaccines, aid shipments. A perfect cover for a perfect crime. As the convoy approached, Damiba went over the plan one last time in his head. His team had trained for this moment non-stop: room-clearing drills, evidence protocols, high-value asset recovery. They knew they'd only have minutes before word got out, and they also knew this might be a trap. No one spends millions setting up drug infrastructure without protection. The warehouse was likely guarded by professionals, possibly ex-military, heavily armed, and ruthless, but Traoré's orders had been clear: get the evidence first. Worry about resistance later. At 1:43 a.m., the convoy rolled up to the compound. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. The warehouse had Ministry of Health signs, government license plates on nearby vehicles, even a community garden out front to reinforce the illusion of public service. But Damiba knew better. In his world, appearances were often the most dangerous part. The raid began with clinical precision. His team moved like clockwork, no shouting, no chaos. Within 90 seconds, the perimeter was secured. Within 3 minutes, the 6 armed guards stationed inside were neutralized and detained. What they found inside was worse than expected. This wasn't a warehouse. It was a fully functioning cocaine factory. There were advanced chemistry labs, better equipped than some universities, automated packaging systems designed to produce thousands of drug packets per hour, storage rooms stacked with raw materials worth tens of millions of dollars. But the worst part, the containers. Dozens of large shipping containers were stamped with official government seals. They were labeled as medical supplies, bound for rural health clinics. And when they opened the containers, sure enough, they found legitimate vaccines, antibiotics, and emergency kits. But hidden inside false compartments was something else. Cocaine. Pure, refined, and packaged. There was so much of it, it made the country's entire foreign aid budget look like pocket change. And the paper trail, it was chilling. All around the warehouse were authentic government documents, real contracts, real permits, real ministerial signatures. There were purchase orders for supplies that had never been ordered, transport permits for convoys that never existed, budget approvals for money that had never shown up in official records. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was state-sponsored crime. And now, they had the proof. The ministers hadn't just looked the other way. They were the ones who built the entire operation, layer by layer, using their government roles as both cover and protection. This wasn't a case of passive corruption. They were the architects of one of the most elaborate drug trafficking networks in all of West Africa. But the final blow came from a small locked office at the back of the warehouse. Inside a steel filing cabinet, Damiba's team found the smoking gun, detailed financial records laying out exactly how the drug money was being split. 20% went to operating costs, 30% to suppliers in South America, another 20% covered transport and logistics, and the remaining 30%. It was deposited directly into offshore bank accounts controlled by 3 sitting ministers. The documents were airtight, complete with dates, account numbers, transaction logs, even biometric signatures. It was as if they never imagined getting caught. Their confidence in their own power had made them sloppy. They had documented their crimes so thoroughly, prosecutors wouldn't need to build a case. The case had already built itself. By 2:05 a.m., Damiba's team had gathered enough evidence to not only end careers, but also secure criminal convict Ions. But they'd also uncovered something urgent, a shipping manifest. It revealed a large cocaine shipment was already on its way to the facility, scheduled to arrive within 6 hours. If the ministers got even a hint of what was happening, they'd cancel the shipment, wipe the facility clean, and eliminate anyone who knew, including the president. Damiba didn't hesitate. He picked up his encrypted satellite communicator and called Traoré directly. The call lasted just 47 seconds. When it ended, both men understood the clock had officially started. "We have 7 hours, Traoré said. "That's all." At 6:30 a.m., 5 ministers received nearly identical phone calls from the presidential palace. The tone was calm, the message brief. The president was calling an emergency cabinet meeting for 8 a.m. to discuss a pressing national security issue. Attendance was mandatory. None of the ministers thought anything of it. In a country constantly teetering between crisis and chaos, emergency meetings weren't unusual. But what they didn't know was that every call had been tapped and recorded. More importantly, 3 of the people receiving those calls would never step into a cabinet meeting again. The first to arrive was Dr. Marie Kabor, Minister of Health. In her 50s, she had long been praised for her work improving rural health care. She had a reputation for compassion and dedication. But the truth behind the public image was horrifying. Dr. Kabor had secretly funneled off life-saving medical supplies, vaccines, surgical tools, basic medications, and sold them on the black market. The profits fed her share of the drug empire. As a result, children died of preventable illnesses. Women died during childbirth without access to essential care. Her wealth came directly from the suffering of the people she was sworn to protect. Next was Minister of Transport Umaru Sawato, younger brother of Colonel Sawato, the man whose dying confession had sparked the entire investigation. One brother had given his life trying to reveal the truth. The other had spent years burying it. Umaru used his office to provide official vehicles for cartel shipments, forge transport documents, and orchestrate fake inspections. The irony was painful. One brother died a hero. The other betrayed everything he stood for. Last to arrive was Minister of Commerce Abdul Khoury, the most dangerous of them all. Charismatic, calculating, and deeply connected, Khoury wasn't just part of the operation. He had started it. He was the first to reach out to South American cartels. He had designed the money laundering systems. He had brought the other ministers into the fold, convincing them that what they were doing wasn't really hurting anyone, that their power protected them. Corey had also been the one who ordered Colonel Sawato's assassination. As the ministers settled into the conference room inside the presidential palace, they had no idea what was coming. They didn't know that for the last 6 weeks. Their phones had been monitored, their bank accounts subpoenaed, their meetings recorded. Every detail of their secret empire, every forged signature, every illegal transfer, every lie had been documented down to the last decimal. They believed they were safe. They believed their positions made them untouchable. They believed their president was either too naive or too cautious to take them on. They were wrong. At exactly 8 a.m., President Ibrahim Traoré entered the cabinet chamber alone. That, in itself, was strange. Usually, a staffer or security aide accompanied him. But what really unnerved the room was his expression: calm, controlled, unreadable. And tucked beneath his arm was a sealed dossier. Burkina Faso's future was now in that room. And justice, real, irreversible justice, was already in motion. The president they were used to, the charismatic, energetic leader who greeted them with warmth and smiles, was gone. The man who entered the room that morning was different. He was silent, still, his expression unreadable. The warmth in his eyes had vanished, replaced with something harder, sharp, calculating, and cold. Traoré sat at the head of the table and slowly looked at each minister, one by one. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Not a single word was spoken, just the sound of uneasy breathing and eyes darting around the table. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you know what betrayal smells like?" His voice was low, calm, but it hung in the air like smoke. The question didn't sound like the start of a cabinet meeting. It sounded like the beginning of an interrogation. Dr. Marie Kabor tried to hold her voice steady. "Mr. President, I'm not sure I understand. What betrayal are you referring to?" Traoré offered a thin, tight smile. "I think you understand perfectly, Doctor. Just as I think Minister Sawato understands. And just as I think Minister Corey understands." At that moment, all 3 ministers froze, inside. Their thoughts were spinning. How much did he know? How deep had the investigation gone? Was there any chance to deny, to deflect, to escape? Outwardly, they kept their expressions neutral. Years of political survival had taught them how to wear masks. But Traoré had been studying those masks for weeks. He saw the slight twitch in Cor's eye, already thinking ahead to an exit plan. He saw the swallow in Sawato's throat, panic taking root. He noticed how Kabor slowed her breathing, bracing herself for denial and spin. It wouldn't help them, not this time. At 8:15 a.m., a side door opened. Colonel Damiba entered the room carrying a locked briefcase and a laptop. 2 technical officers followed, quietly setting up microphones and screens around the chamber. The atmosphere shifted immediately. The ministers shifted in their seats, no longer in control. The room, once theirs, now felt foreign, threatening. Minister Corey finally broke. "What's going on here? Why are we being recorded?" Traoré's reply was calm, almost soft, but every word landed like a blow. "Because the people of Burkina Faso deserve to see justice, and they deserve to know that no one is above the law." Damiba placed a thick folder in front of the 3 ministers. Then he opened the laptop, connected it to the room's sound system, and gave a single nod. Traoré stood. "What you're about to hear," he said, "are recorded conversations between you, my own ministers, and known cartel operatives. These recordings were collected over the past 18 months as part of an internal investigation into organized drug trafficking within our government." He pressed play. The first recording filled the room. It was a phone call between Corey and a Colombian contact. They were discussing shipment schedules, payment amounts, and safe transit routes, all in clear detail. The voices were unmistakable. There was no background noise, no distortion. It was a perfect recording, and the content left no room for doubt. Color drained from Cor's face. He had used burner phones, fake IDs, and layers of middlemen to cover his tracks. None of it had worked. The net had still closed around him. The second recording was even more disturbing. Dr. Kabor was calmly explaining how to remove vaccines from medical supply crates, to create hidden space for cocaine. Her voice was steady, clinical, describing in exact terms how to bypass inspections without raising suspicion. Then came the third. Minister Sawato was heard giving detailed instructions about border patrol schedules and checkpoint locations. He was handing over his country's security, selling out his own people for cartel money. When the final recording stopped, the room went dead silent. The three ministers sat motionless, pale and visibly shaken. They weren't just exposed. They were finished. But Traoré wasn't done. Demi Ba pulled out another folder, this one filled with bank statements, wire transfers, and investment records. Accounts in Switzerland, properties in Dubai, offshore assets in the Cayman Islands. Traoré read the numbers aloud. According to these records, the three of you received over $47 million in cartel payments. That money funded private jets, luxury homes, exotic cars, and all while our Ministry of Health reported shortages of basic medical supplies, while the Ministry of Transport said there were no funds to repair village roads, while the Ministry of Commerce claimed there was no budget to support small businesses. He paused, then looked each of them in the eye. While our people suffered, you lived like kings, off blood money. Minister Corey finally spoke, his voice dry and cracking. Mr. President, I can explain. These calls, they're out of context. The records don't tell the full story. Traoré cut him off with a bitter laugh. Then please, Minister, he said coldly, explain the context in which treason becomes acceptable. Explain how stealing vaccines from children makes sense. In any plan, economic or otherwise. Dr. Kabor tried a different angle. Her tone softened, a desperate attempt to reframe the narrative. Even if some of it is true, we were trying to help in our own way. We reinvested that money into development. We were finding creative solutions. Her voice trembled. It sounded more like a performance than a defense, but the room remained cold. The evidence had spoken, and no one was buying the act anymore. Traoré's voice was calm, but it had turned to steel. The only development project you funded was a villa in Monaco, he said. The only people who benefited from your creativity were Colombian cartels and European bankers. Minister Sawato didn't respond. He didn't argue or beg. He just stared down at the table. He knew it was over. There would be no secret deal, no quiet resignation, no last-minute escape into exile. Only justice. At exactly 9:01 a.m., the doors to the cabinet chamber opened again. 6 masked operatives entered the room in full tactical gear. Their black uniforms bore no insignias. They moved with silent, practiced precision, quickly surrounding the table, 2 officers per accused minister. Traoré stood and spoke clearly. Marie Kabore, Umaru Sawato, Abdul Kori, you are under arrest for high treason, drug trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy against the state of Burkina Faso. You will face trial, and the people will decide your fate. The words hung in the air like thunder. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself had stopped. Then Corey made a desperate choice. He shoved his chair backward and lunged toward the nearest door, maybe believing he could escape through the palace grounds, maybe believing there was still some route out of this. He didn't make it far. 3 steps, that's all, before he could reach the exit. 2 operatives tackled him to the ground. In seconds, his arms were wrenched behind his back and locked in steel cuffs. The attempt to flee only added one more charge to his growing list, resisting arrest. Dr. Kabore, in contrast, tried to remain composed. She stood slowly and faced the president. Mr. President, she said, her voice tight but controlled, I have served this country for 20 years. I've dedicated my life to improving health care for our people. I deserve better than this. Traoré didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. You deserve exactly what you're getting, he said. It's the people you were supposed to serve who deserved better, not to be sold to drug traffickers. Then came the most surprising reaction of all. Minister Sawato didn't resist. He didn't say a word in protest. As the operatives moved toward him, he gave a small, sad smile, a quiet kind of surrender. I'm sorry, Mr. President, he said. I'm sorry about my brother. I'm sorry about everything. It was the first genuine emotion anyone at that table had shown. For a brief second, Traoré saw the man Sawato used to be, before greed and fear turned him into something else. But remorse, no matter how real, couldn't erase the damage done. As the handcuffs snapped shut on the wrists of his former ministers, Traoré felt a wave of emotion wash over him. There was satisfaction. Yes, justice had been served, relief. Too, the conspiracy had finally been dismantled. But beneath it all, there was something heavier. Grief. Grief for what had been lost. Grief for broken trust. Grief for an entire nation betrayed by the very people sworn to protect it. Two ministers had remained silent the entire time. The Minister of Education and the Minister of Agriculture. They hadn't been part of the drug network, at least. Not according to the investigation. But the look on their faces said enough. They were shaken. Traoré turned to them. "You're free to go," he said. "But let me make this clear. This government will not tolerate corruption at any level. If either of you has been involved in anything illegal, now is the time to come forward." Both men nodded quickly, assuring him they had nothing to hide. Their voices trembled. They had just watched 3 of their colleagues be taken out of a cabinet meeting in handcuffs. There was no confusion about what had just happened. From this moment on, integrity wasn't optional. It was the new rule. By 9:20 a.m., the story had already hit the media. Radio stations, news websites, and social media feeds across Burkina Faso exploded with the headline, "President Ibrahim Traoré arrests 3 cabinet ministers for treason and drug trafficking." First came disbelief, then shock, and then something unexpected. Hope. In markets, offices, and cafes, people gathered around radios and phones. In small villages, where corruption had always felt like an unshakable part of life, people began to talk differently. They looked at one another and started to believe change was possible. The arrests weren't just a political move. They were a statement, a line drawn in the sand, a message to every citizen and every official. This is not the old Burkina Faso. This is a new era. But Traoré knew better than to celebrate too soon. The hardest part was just beginning. At 10:15 a.m., while the arrested ministers were being quietly transferred to secure detention, President Traoré received the phone call he had been expecting. It was the French ambassador, a well-spoken diplomat, calm and measured, but with clear concern in his voice. "Mr. President," he began, "I'm calling to express France's unease over the dramatic developments in your government this morning. We sincerely hope these arrests represent due process, not political retaliation." The message was polite, but the meaning was obvious. Was this really justice or just a purge? Too many African leaders had used anti-corruption campaigns as cover to eliminate rivals. The international community was paying attention. Traoré didn't hesitate. "No," he replied sharply, "this is war." Then he hung up. The call served as a reminder. This was bigger than Burkina Faso. The world was watching, measuring every move. If this crusade against corruption was to survive scrutiny, it had to be more than dramatic arrests. It had to be legal, structured, and undeniable. So that's exactly what Traoré made it. By 11 a.m., his administration was in full motion. Bank accounts tied to shell companies were frozen. Investigators confirmed the companies had been receiving direct payments from South American cartels funneled through fake business fronts set up by Burkinabe officials. By 11:30 a.m., the military shut down to remote airstrips that the Ministry of Transport had falsely registered for agricultural use, hidden inside hangars. At both locations were unmarked planes used to smuggle cocaine in and out of the country. Their flight plans had been pre-programmed to avoid radar and official checkpoints. By 12:10 p.m., customs officials raided the estate of a well-known businessman and philanthropist, someone who had earned public praise for funding schools, clinics, and clean water projects. But beneath the surface, his foundation was a front, a sophisticated laundering machine that turned cartel cash into polished charity. By 1 p.m., a high-ranking judge who had dismissed 5 major drug trafficking cases in the last year was suspended pending investigation. All 5 cases, investigators revealed, had ties to the same cartel network uncovered that morning. And every single step of the operation, every raid, every statement, every frozen account, was made public. There were no whispers, no backroom deals, no cover-ups, This wasn't a coup, it was accountability. Performance reviews became mandatory. Ministers and department heads were no longer shielded by their titles. If they failed to deliver, or if misconduct was uncovered, they could now be held personally responsible. No more hiding behind bureaucracy. No more excuses. But the most transformative shift wasn't legal, it was cultural. For decades, corruption in Burkina Faso had been seen as a low-risk, high-reward game. That illusion was gone. After the arrests and televised trials, corruption became high-risk with devastating consequences, not just for reputations, but for careers and personal freedom. 6 months later, the world began to take notice. Transparency International upgraded Burkina Faso's ranking by 15 places, a rare jump. The World Bank, which had held back development loans for years, approved funding after citing significant improvements in governance. Foreign investors who had written the country off slowly began to return, encouraged by a new sense of stability and trust in the rule of law. But most importantly, ordinary citizens began to see real change. Medical supplies that had once vanished mysteriously now made it to remote clinics. Road construction projects, long plagued by delays and inflated costs, were finished on time and within budget. Schools that were once drawn only in proposals were now standing, built with the very funds that used to disappear into offshore accounts. The Ministry of Health's drug network was fully dismantled. International law enforcement reported a noticeable drop in cocaine shipments moving through West Africa. Cartels were forced to find alternate routes. Their operations were disrupted, their costs soared, and their influence weakened, at least in Burkina Faso. Eventually, the 3 arrested ministers stood trial in open court, under full media scrutiny. Every proceeding was broadcast live across the country. For the people, it became more than a legal process. It was national therapy, a long-awaited sign that justice wasn't just talked about, but enforced. The verdicts came down hard. Dr. Marie Kabore was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Minister Umaru Sawato received 30 years, and Minister Abdul Kori, the man who built the network from the ground up, was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. But as powerful as those convictions were, Traoré knew that the real legacy of this movement wasn't in punishing the guilty, it was in transforming the innocent. Across the government, officials who had long operated under a quiet expectation of corruption now found themselves in a completely different environment. Honesty wasn't optional, it was demanded. The fear of being caught in Traoré's next investigation motivated a level of transparency the country had never seen before. And for young people, something even more important was happening. They had grown up in a system where success often came from connections, bribes, and silence. Now, for the first time, they were witnessing a president hold his own ministers accountable in front of the entire nation. The rule of law, once seen as a distant concept, now felt real. International partners took notice. Where there had once been skepticism, there was now cautious optimism. If Burkina Faso was truly serious about fighting corruption, then maybe, just maybe, it was also serious about building a stable, thriving economy. The economic results spoke for themselves. Within a year, foreign direct investment rose by 40%. Businesses that had previously operated in the shadows started registering legally. Tax compliance surged, and as government revenues increased, so did funding for education, health care, and infrastructure. But with that success came new threats. Burkina Faso's improving reputation didn't go unnoticed by the wrong people. Criminal networks, cartels displaced by anti-drug campaigns in neighboring countries, began looking toward Burkina Faso as a potential new base. They wanted to test the system. The most dangerous test came 18 months after the original arrests. A Venezuelan businessman named Carlos Mendoza quietly approached several mid-level customs officials. He offered generous bribes in exchange for letting irregular shipping paperwork slide through. It was a critical moment. Would these officials take the bait, like so many before them had, or would they do what was now expected? In this new Burkina Faso, every single official made the same decision. They reported the attempted bribes within 48 hours. Mendoza was arrested at Ouagadougou. Airport trying to leave the country. His laptop revealed he had attempted similar schemes in 6 other West African nations. His arrest helped trigger a larger crackdown on cartel activity across the region. It was a quiet victory, the kind that confirmed something important. Traoré's reforms weren't just working on paper. They were working in practice. But no, change comes without resistance. That as the president's anti-corruption campaign gained momentum, political opposition began to push back. Critics accused Traoré of ruling by fear. International observers worried that his growing investigative powers could one day be used to silence dissent or pressure rivals. Traoré listened, and then he responded with action. He created independent oversight bodies to review every anti-corruption investigation. These agencies were structured to report directly to Parliament and the judiciary, not to the presidency. Then, in a bold move that stunned even his allies, Traoré introduced term limits for the office of the president, and he made those limits apply to himself. He gave up power voluntarily. It was a message to the world and to his own people. This wasn't about creating a new strongman. It was about building a new system, a system where accountability wasn't just a campaign slogan, but a reality, a system where even the most powerful could fall, and where even the weakest had the right to expect justice. And for the first time in Burkina Faso's history, that system was working. President Traoré had done more than dismantle a cartel. He had broken a cycle, shattered a culture where impunity was the norm, where power meant protection, and where corruption was seen not as a crime, but as a rite of passage. He didn't rule through fear. He led through principle, through action, through sacrifice, and for the first time in a generation, the people of Burkina Faso didn't just believe in a leader, they believed in a system. That belief would become the foundation of a new kind of republic. His final act stunned nearly everyone, with his approval ratings soaring. Many expected Traoré to extend his time in office, maybe even indefinitely. Instead, he did the opposite. He voluntarily imposed term limits on himself. It was vintage Traoré, unexpected, principled, and strategically brilliant. The move sent a clear message. His mission had never been about personal power. It was about building something that could last without him, and it worked. Future presidents wouldn't just inherit Traoré's reforms. They would inherit his restrictions. They would be bound by the same accountability he held others to. If they tried to misuse power, the very systems he created would turn against them. By the time Traoré's presidency entered its final year, global organizations had begun studying what they now called the Burkina Faso model, a potential blueprint for governance reform across Africa. Its principles were simple: zero tolerance for corruption, evidence-based law enforcement, full public accountability, and perhaps most critically, voluntary limits on executive authority. But those principles, no matter how well designed, meant nothing without the kind of leadership willing to put them into action. And that was the one part no manual could teach, because all of it had started with one man willing to risk everything, not to stay in power, but to do what was right. That morning, the day of the arrests, had been a gamble, a quiet, dangerous bet on something deeper than politics. President Traoré had placed his faith not in weapons or popularity, but in the conscience of his people. He believed that the country was ready for something better, something different, that the people would stand behind a leader who chose justice over loyalty and truth over silence. He was right. 3 years later, the transformation was undeniable. Burkina Faso was being hailed as one of Africa's most improved democracies. Economic growth had doubled. The country's corruption ranking had jumped more than 30 places. Public trust in government institutions was at an all-time high. But none of that captured the real win. The true change wasn't in reports or indexes. It was in people's hearts. For the first time, everyday citizens started to believe the system could work for them, that honesty wasn't weakness, and that hard work could actually go somewhere. For the first time in a generation, parents told their children they could succeed without bribery, without shortcuts, without betrayal, and it had all started in one room, a room with 5 men. 3 of them thought they were invincible. 1 of them thought otherwise. President Traoré proved that the hardest battles aren't fought against your enemies, but against the people standing next to you. He showed that leadership isn't about protecting the powerful, it's about protecting the powerless. And that real courage is measured not by how loudly you fight, but by what you're willing to sacrifice. Because in the end, the story wasn't about drugs. It wasn't even about politics. It was about choice. The choice to investigate instead of ignore. The choice to hold people accountable, even when they helped you rise. The choice to lead with integrity, even when it's the harder road. That day when Traoré looked his ministers in the eye and asked, "Do you know what betrayal smells like?" He wasn't talking about money. He was talking about the betrayal of trust, the betrayal of hope, the betrayal of an entire nation's future by those trusted to protect it. And when the handcuffs finally closed, there was no revenge, no spectacle, just law, just truth, just the cold, steady hand of justice doing what it was always meant to do. Those ministers thought their power made them untouchable. Instead, their power made them accountable to the people, to the country, and to history. Traoré simply believed something different, and that belief made all the difference. In the end, this wasn't just a story of corruption or reform. It was about the oldest battle of all, between what is and what could be, between cynicism and courage, between accepting the world as broken or choosing to fix it. President Ibrahim Traoré chose hope. And this time, hope won. The whisper that started it all, "The president knows," became a roar that echoed across West Africa and beyond. Other presidents began asking questions about their own inner circles. Citizens in neighboring countries started demanding the same justice, the same accountability, the same truth. The quiet revolution that began in a sealed room with handcuffs, a laptop, and the truth turned into a continent-wide reckoning, a reminder that integrity is contagious, that courage is magnetic, and that the most powerful thing a leader can do proves that no one is above the law, not even the people who helped you rise.